William Faulkner is widely considered one of the greatest writers of all time. His novels can be found on pretty much every syllabus for a modern American literature class. He is a father of modernism and a paragon of Southern Gothic literature. He is, in short, a lionized literary luminary. You will find his name mentioned in the same breath as other iconic and equally canonized names like Shakespeare, Dickens, Fitzgerald, Austen, and Poe. Unlike these names, though, Faulkner is not associated with any successful film adaptations. It's often the case that in order for an author's name to truly bleed into the mainstream imagination, they have to have inspired some successful movie adaptations. No such luck for Faulkner. Why is that? In 1956, Lee Kaplan knew his next-door neighbor was an important man, a novelist whose books were supposed to be dark and complicated. But to 10-year-old Lee, the author was a friendly, avuncular man who attended his Little League games. Some referred to him as Bill, but to the boy, he was always Mr. Faulkner. One day, Lee read Mr. Faulkner's short story, The Bear, a coming-of-age tale about a boy who grows up to deny his inheritance of land that was tied to his family's past involvement in the antebellum slave trade. The young Lee was floored by the story, and eventually cornered his neighbor. Mr. Faulkner, he said, this would make such a great movie. But the novelist didn't humor the boy. Not all books, Faulkner said, can be movies. This anecdote is about Lee Kaplan, who is now the executor of William Faulkner's literary estate and a producer of James Franco's adaptations of As I Lay Dying and The Sound and the Fury. Kaplan, it seems, didn't take Faulkner's sentiment to heart. In 2013, with Kaplan's help, Franco wrote, directed, and starred in the film version of Faulkner's As I Lay Dying. It was a financial and critical flop. The following year, Franco followed this failure up by writing, directing, and starring in Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury. It was a financial and critical flop. In response to Franco's unpopular adaptations, many critics repeated in some form the old refrain that Faulkner's novels may, in fact, be unfilmable and unadaptable. Though, as scholar C.J. Barton notes, some critics cautiously acknowledge that in more experienced hands than Franco's, these literary masterpieces of modernist prose might one day be more satisfyingly adapted. Might. One day. Maybe. These are the operative terms when it comes to discussing Faulkner's film adaptations. That's because Franco is not the first to helm an unsuccessful or quickly forgotten Faulknerian film. Several have tried. 7, in fact. 7 previous full-length films based on Faulkner's novels, and a handful of films based on his short stories, including a previous attempt to adapt The Sound and the Fury in 1959. Like almost all of the attempts to bring Faulkner's novels to screen, this version of The Sound and the Fury was poorly received and is now mostly forgotten, despite involving some notable silver screen stars like Yul Brynner and Joanne Woodward. But more about this adaptation soon. The first attempt to bring a Faulkner novel to the screen came in 1933 with The Story of Temple Drake, a loose adaptation of Faulkner's pulp crime thriller Sanctuary, released just 2 years prior. This is the only Faulkner adaptation that has maintained much of a notable legacy, one mostly buoyed by its controversy upon release.
You putty-faced little fool. Now you're satisfied. You got 'em all fighting over you. You nice women.
In 9 subsequent decades, there have been remarkably few Faulkner adaptations, and for those brave few who have attempted them, the results have been more lackluster than blockbuster. Faulkner himself struggled to adapt William Faulkner, and notably, Even he didn't take a swing at some of his more experimental works, like As I Lay Dying and The Sound of the Fury. Faulkner worked in Hollywood, famously moonlighting as a screenwriter to supplement his income as a novelist. He was in a better position than anyone else to bring his written words to the silver screen. In fact, after he began working for MGM Studios, his first feature-length screenplay ventured to adapt one of his more accessible short stories, Turnabout, an action-filled World War I tale. This script, filmed as Today We Live after extensive rewriting by other screenwriters, resulted in only mixed critical and box office success. A second attempt, Warbirds, drew on the World War I material from his short story Ad Astra and from his early, less experimental novel Flags in the Dust, was riddled with inconsistency and never produced. As Bartonek writes, that even Faulkner, who was reaching the height of his artistic powers, having written The Sound and the Fury and As I Lay Dying and the forthcoming Light in August, found difficulty in adapting his more straightforward and seemingly film-friendly material, reveals much about the challenges of adapting art for a new medium, especially one that is highly collaborative. The path of adaptation is fraught with peril. More perilous for some than others, since we can compare this to, say, Charles Dickens, whose David Copperfield has alone been adapted into film more times than all of Faulkner's novels combined, and that's not even looking at the 50-plus movie versions of A Christmas Carol. Faulkner and Dickens are both literary giants, appearing in their respective canons as matters of course. So what the Dickens accounts for this massive disparity in their respective adaptability? The easiest answer to this question is that Faulkner's writing is just way too modernist for film. Faulkner's style both focused on and pushed the boundaries of the form of the novel. He experimented and played with the written word in ways exclusive to the written word. His novels often involve long stream of consciousness passages, flashbacks that blend seamlessly into the present tense, chronological chaos, shifting perspectives, and sensuous monologues. Take this passage from As I Lay Dying, when the child called Vardaman sneaks into a barn after learning of his mother's death. Faulkner describes Vardaman's experience of seeing a horse as though the dark were resolving him out of his integrity into an unrelated scattering of components, snuffings and stampings, smells of cooling flesh and ammoniac hair, an illusion of a coordinated whole of splotched hide and strong bones within which, detached and secret and familiar, and is different from my is. As Joseph Enton of the LA Review of Books writes, such passages insist that we slow down, read, and reread. The expectations of narrative clarity that drive a major motion picture, in which the progress of the plot ultimately takes priority over innovations in cinematic form, make the medium an uneasy fit for Faulkner's novels, the content of which is so often manifested in the very texture of the writing. Things get even messier when we consider that some scholars have argued that Faulkner's writing is well suited for movies. And not only that, but his writing is particularly or especially cinematic, ready-made for the big screen. In his book, Vision's Imminence, Faulkner, Film, and the Popular Imagination, Peter Lurie seeks to complicate the common reading of Faulkner's work by describing it as something separate from and higher than mass-produced consumer art made for popular audiences, and showing how Faulkner uses filmic techniques throughout his written works. Conceptualizing Faulkner's novels as unfilmable stems from the idea that there's something about modern art that is expressly resistant to easy commodification and consumption. Lurie, in contrast, argues that Faulkner uses techniques that approximate the experience of viewing a film. Faulkner frequently deploys what he calls the film idea, which is an impressionistic recreation of visual activities meant to emulate the movie-going experience, an experience that, at its core, is rapidly consumable and easily accessible to mass audiences. Lurie makes the case that Faulkner's novels are not fundamentally unadaptable or unfilmable. On top of that, Lurie makes the case that Faulkner's work is focused on vision, Characters are always looking and being looked at. They describe what they're seeing and feeling. This, says Lurie, is the stuff that movies are made of. What we're left with, then, is a tale of two Faulkners. The first is a Faulkner whose prose is esoteric, sometimes paradoxical, with intricate sentences and formidable themes that are, at heart, suited only for discerning fireside readers with their pipes in hand. The second is a Faulkner who writes sensuous, highly visual stories that have, at least hypothetically, awesome cinematic potential. But so far, no filmmaker, and least of all Franco, has successfully tapped into the cinematic potential. To his credit, Franco certainly tried to do justice to some of the things that make Faulkner so special. The critic A.O. Scott said that, in rushing in where wise men might fear to tread, Mr. Franco has accomplished something serious and worthwhile. In both As I Lay Dying and The Sound and the Fury, Franco endeavors to distill the profusion of narrative voices while still leaning on the same general structure of the novels, and he uses Faulkner's actual words for most of the script. Contrast this with the 1959 version of The Sound and the Fury, which abandoned much of Faulkner's story and dialogue and adopted an entirely conventional, linear narrative, complete with continuity editing. Franco tried to tap into the chaotic, disjointed ambiance of Faulkner's work by utilizing a nonlinear narrative structure and a host of formal techniques, such as rapid, discontinuous editing, split screen, fourth wall breaking monologues,
12. So I made it on a bevel.
whispery voiceover,
Daddy, she didn't smell like the trees.
slow motion, and speed ramping. Were these effective? Depends on who you ask. Some called them first-year film student gimmicks that murdered Faulkner's work. Critics for the AV Club agreed, calling Franco's attempts at filmmaking an academic art object, somewhere halfway between a graduate thesis and a video installation. Still, at least Franco tried to tap into these Faulknerian flourishes. But unfortunately, these two movies suffered more than just on the formal front. They were both lambasted for the acting, including Franco's baffling choice to cast himself as the developmentally delayed Benji in The Sound and the Fury. IndieWire critic Jessica Kang wrote that the portrayal of Benji was starring Franco's half-wit buck-toothed dentures in the role, and also Franco himself, we suppose. Franco's Benji roils, spasms, groans, gurns, and flails his way through an interminable first third of the movie. These acting choices, combined with the polarizing formalistic choices, led to general dismissal and occasional outright ridicule of Franco's films. So what are we left with? Is the historical struggle to adapt Faulkner reason enough to concede his work is inherently unfilmable? Or like Lurie, are we justified in maintaining optimism that Faulkner's cinematic potential simply remains untapped? Movies are, after all, a relatively young medium. Technology is advancing at such a rapid pace, and broadly speaking, cinema's potential as a whole is largely untapped. Personally, I think some cautious optimism for Faulkner films is warranted. We need only to look at the ways movies have already succeeded in experimenting with the medium in characteristically modernist ways. Fractured narratives, modernist classics like Rashomon, dating back 3/4 of a century, succeed in portraying multiple conflicting narrators that force the viewer to question notions of truth and reality. Stream of consciousness? Choose from a host of critically acclaimed movies with contemplative, impressionistic monologues that give raw access to the consciousness of characters. Nonlinear chronology? Got plenty of those too. How about a movie told backward? Or one where time literally moves in reverse? Formalistic experimentation? Technology has opened doors here that were inconceivable a mere decade or two ago. Should all hope for a successful Faulkner adaptation be abandoned? Personally, I don't think so. The time has never been better to make movies adapted from and inspired by Faulkner's visionary style and sensibilities. But it would probably be a good idea not to leave it in the handsy hands of James Franco.
Maybe. Maybe!